Hi, I've been thinking a lot about the rise of fascism around the world and not least in the United States. Uh, Doing a lot of thinking about what explains it. And I want to talk today about a piece of that um, I don't think that we give enough attention to. Um, that is, there seems to be a lot of people in America and apparently around the world for whom freedom, a society in which different groups of people exist constructively and happily together without being the same, is not a place where they feel like they can thrive, that they have some kind of need that's not being met. Years and years ago, I read a book by Erich Fromm called The Escape from Freedom. He had lived through another time in which fascism rose. His book was written in 1941, and it was his way of coming to understand what had happened in the world of Germany that turned toward the Nazis and away from freedom. What he thought was that the Germans of his time were finding freedom frightening, that it put too much responsibility on them to arrive at their own truths, um, to find their own kinds of meaning in their life. Um, and that was not something they felt equipped to do, and that they felt a need for something that would impose a way, a form on everybody. And there's been research about certain kinds of family structures that make people broken in certain ways, that make it hard for them to be at peace with themselves, to be all of a piece. Uh, some kind of harshness that gets internalized that prevents people from being themselves, some kind of coercive force that works upon them as they grow up, so that there isn't a path that they find for themselves. And living in a society in which there are lots of differences and lots of rights for people to create their own lives, well, that just is scary. They need the meaning, they need the truth, but they need for it to be given to them. That's not too far off from what Fromm thought he saw in Germany. And I'm wondering, how much is that what's going on in America today? I mean, I, I'm forced to wonder about this because we who live in societies like this, where we're free and where we're pretty prosperous by any human standard, we're among the most fortunate people in the history of the world. I mean, this is so much better than so many people had it. Yet when I look at the politics of the part of America that's MAGA, of tens of millions of people, clearly this is not uh, a bunch of people who are feeling like they're sitting on top of the world. There's something that's making them unhappy, is just a catch-all word, miserable, conflicted, afraid, some kind of not good. I mean, you don't come to these kinds of conspiracy theories about, oh, Democrats running some kind of child sex trafficking ring out of a pizza parlor in D.C. I mean, that's crazy. This is not the sign of people who are thriving. But why aren't they thriving? Well, I've in my explanation, trying to explain how fascism has arisen in America, I've put a lot of emphasis on the genius of some of the propagandists like Limbaugh and Gingrich, and then Murdoch, Fox News, Ailes rising on TV and capturing so many minds and hearts. And then Karl Rove as the Bush's brain that poisoned American minds even further. Um, and I think that that is a big part of it. But I'm wondering, maybe the propagandists succeeded because they were a match to light up some kind of kindling in the souls of people that had dried up because somehow they weren't comfortable living in the kind of society that the founders of this country envisioned, breaking through into a kind of democracy where there are different where different religions are allowed to prosper and not be persecuted, where different races and ethnicities live side by side and share a nationality around certain kinds of values that you can see in the citizenship things. But there's a, um, a need for the kind of uniformity, conformity that is threatened by some of the things that seem to be accompanying the rise of fascism, like the intolerance of immigration. Maybe immigration is, you don't want, if you need for there to be a one way kind of a thing, that you're not comfortable seeing a Chinatown or a barrio where they're your fellow Americans, but they're not the same as you. And you hearken back to a time when your ethnic group, Anglo-Saxon whites, was pretty much the only thing you saw, or if it wasn't the only thing, then the other big group, the blacks, were oppressed and tyrannized into a second class status. Uh, how much of the hostility toward another race is coming from the same place as the unwillingness to have immigration, or the insistence on there being one religious way forward? I mean, you can see that when Protestantism rose in Europe, then we had 100 years of war. Our ancestors who founded this country wanted a different kind of world. And so they created a system with free speech, and they created with free press. And everybody's free to practice their own religion, and the state will not impose a religion on everybody. I just saw the movie Elizabeth, and the first Elizabeth, the daughter of her father, Henry VIII, that had broken away from Rome. And there are wars being fought in Scotland and assassination plots over whether the Catholics or the Protestants will rule England. This was a difficult thing for people to manage. And so maybe there's something that we need to understand about why it took a long time to get to the point where one had a free society like the Constitution, where power is exercised from the bottom up, the will of the people choosing who will wield power and enforcing that there be the rule of law. Versus the other way, which some people in America, or a lot of people, seem to be hankering for, or at least open to. I mean, Donald Trump was obviously assaulting that whole system when 74 million Americans voted for him. So this is an old part of people, and um, how do we develop the people who will thrive in these kinds of societies that are obviously the best kind of societies, at least in fundamental ways that humankind has yet devised. We are the luckiest people in the history of the world. We are not slaves building monuments to absolute rulers like most people once were. We are not subjects of a crown that answers to nobody. But some people want us to have not a president, but a king, to go to language that Judge Chuck just used. How do we make people um, who can thrive in this best of potential human worlds? What do we do so that people don't emerge intolerant of immigrants, intolerant of other races and ethnicities, intolerant of people with different sexual orientation or who are not clear about their gender identities in the same conventional way? That is the challenge that we face. Um, and it is part of the immediate political challenge of the election of 2024, um, which is at its heart a choice between being a free and democratic society, as our founders intended for us to be, or becoming a fascistic, authoritarian society that some people seem to want. And they seem to want it, I'm believing, from what I've read about Fromm's Escape from Reading, from Freedom, and then Alice Miller's For Your Own Good about how children were raised in the Germanic world. There are family structures that uh, make people broken in some ways that impede their blossoming into their authentic whole selves. Um, uh, there, and we can see it also in the schools that the fascists want us to have, where people are being broken in being inculcated with false views of the history of their society and the meaning of the forces that are in play and, say, the relationship between the races. And people who don't want their children to be exposed to the fact that human sexuality is actually complex. And that if you're going to apply the golden rule because you're a good Christian, what that means is that when people are different from you, you don't treat them in a way you wouldn't want to be treated. Which brings, you know that this fascism thing is broken because there's so much hypocrisy to it. I mean, make America great again. I mean, it's so much the opposite that it's grotesque. I mean, the way the rest of the world views us because Trump got elected in 2016 is down several notches. We do not look as great as we did before. There were problems with how we looked before, but with Trump, now the president of the United States has to deal with allies that don't feel confident that we are going to be the leader of the free world for much longer. But there are other ways you can see the hypocrisy and brokenness of the whole thing. A story I lately hit upon, that shows that the fascist spirit is not one of wholeness, but of brokenness. There's a story about Mike McCarthy that I didn't know. I mean, when none of us knew about Mike McCarthy, he was nobody. But now he's second in line for the presidency, was unanimously chosen by the same party that's following Donald Trump. And there was a case where a family that was not Christian brought suit to prevent the public schools to which they were sending their children, to prevent those schools from subjecting their children every morning to participate in a situation of Christian prayer. So what Mike McCarthy said about this situation is just so rich with toxic meaning. He said the ultimate goal of the enemy is to silence the Gospels. By enemy, he meant this family that brought the suit and that didn't want their children subjected in a public school, which is an extension of the state, to be subjected to a religion that is different from, in some ways contrary to, the religion in which they were bringing up their children. Now, you could ask Mike McCarthy, and you could ask any other Christian of this ilk, would you like, if you had children in the public schools, would you want your children, and the majority of the people in that public school were Muslim or Hindu, would you want your children to be compelled in that class to be part of Islamic or Hindu prayers? And I think we know that he wouldn't. I mean, we know that. I mean, this kind of fundamentalism. I remember people out here in the Shenandoah Valley who thought that yoga was of the devil because it came from a different tradition. People have a lot of scary things inside them and a lot of fear inside them. But you know that the answer is he would not want his children in the position that this family he called the enemy didn't want their children. Now, the central moral teaching of the Gospels, I would say, is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But here we have Mike McCarthy, in the name of the Gospels, violating the central moral teaching of the Gospels. He wouldn't want that done unto him and have with his children. But he insists that those who want what he would want are the enemy, who are trying to silence the Gospels. Everything gets turned into its opposite. The guy who, in the fascist world, it is typical that the Christian who thinks he's advancing Christianity is attacking it. So the Freedom Caucus in the House of Representatives, everything is the opposite of what it is. So we have a difficult job to do if there are tens of millions of people who are feeling some attraction to the fascist path. It's not just that they're obviously having some important need that's not being met. And what's desirable is for the situation to be created where the children who come up in our society get their needs met well in the kind of society that our Constitution is trying to create. And that's actually got to do with two different uh, components. There's the need for the people to be more whole so that they don't need to have, you know, the rally in Nuremberg Square where they're all cheering the same thing and all enraptured and ecstatic, following every word of the Fuhrer. Not only do we need people who can find meaning and truth and authenticity and their own individuality and feel fulfilled, but we need a society which provides as much as possible within that framework of people's deep needs for truth and meaning. Now, in the 1990s, I did talk radio out here, and I did several conversations around the bumper sticker that says, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. It's hard to run a democracy with people who have no interest in mutual exploration, in dialogue, in a pluralistic society in which we work together to find common ground. That settles it is the theocrats' way of looking at it. We can see that in the Dobbs decision. On the issue of abortion, I actually don't think that the way that the court established the right to an abortion was constitutionally the best way to do it. Privacy. I would have preferred they do it in terms of one religious view will not be imposed upon others who don't hold that religious view. That's where I think it should have been. But anyway, I could have imagined that there could be a way that some court would reject Roe v. Wade. But the Dobbs decision had special spirit in it, a theocratic spirit. It was filled with hostility toward people who had come to other conclusions. Theocracy is one of the dimensions of the same pattern of brokenness. It could be called fascism or could be called authoritarianism, but I like fascism for the total name. I mean, a lot of different things. And was the Pharaoh's regime fascistic? Well, not by some definitions, but basically it's all there. The top-down aspect of it, the injustice aspect of it, the manipulation and exploitation of the people are aspects of it. So I think that we need to help fortify the various ways that human beings can be helped to become happy, fulfilled members of a free society, rather than what you see in the square in Nuremberg, where they're getting meaning, but it's going to be part of a historical nightmare. But I think that we also need to look at our own free way of being a free society. I would say that there are ways in which our society has a spiritual vacuum that the ideal free society is not one in which there are only conveniences and people selling each other goods and people looking out for their own interests. A free society can be built around a more genuine shared sense of meaning, of value, even of the sacred. I mean, we have an economy which is continually teaching us that the path to fulfillment um, lies in what can be bought and sold. Well, all the spiritual traditions say that that's really not true. We might want to find some way to increase our capacity to communicate with each other in ways which reinforce some shared sense of the sacred. The teacher that is the advertisement is a teacher that's trying to use what's out there in other people, not to give them fulfillment, but to succeed in getting them to spend on whatever you're selling. Fortunately, people can make sometimes good decisions and find fulfillment things through the things that can be bought and sold. But over time, a society gets emptied out. We're a couple centuries along in this history of people being taught by a very powerful teacher that goods are what's of value. I wrote a book published by Harper in 1993 called Fool's Gold, The Fate of Values in a World of Goods. I don't have any quick fix on how we continue to be a free society and also a commercial society, and how we don't have materialistic values swapping all the other kinds of values that our spiritual traditions are saying are really what's at the heart of things. But I think we should at least recognize that that's part of the challenge. And our politics also, I think one of the things we've come to is a society in which some of the sense of the sacred that the American civil religion, as Robert Bella, my old mentor, called it, civil religion in America, the shared things that we talk about on the 4th of July, or that we used to talk about, and the way that our schools, for example, used to teach civics. I took, had civics in 8th, 9th grades or whatever, and it was not a very impressive thing. But there are things that can be taught as American civics, because if all you got to do is look at the Bill of Rights and see the whole history of tyrannical evil written there as a shadow of what's there on the page, where it says things like, basically, you can't torture people to make them confess. That's in the Fifth Amendment. You can't force them to testify against themselves. You're not to have cruel and unusual punishments. I mean, there are nightmares behind all that. And the escape from those nightmares, I mean, the change from the prosecutorial world in which witches were burned at the stake, in which people suspected were tortured with fire and with thumb presses and with the rack to say things to get the pain to stop. You can see that in the Bill of Rights and the crucial progress, the huge leap forward that when our Constitution was laid down, the human world's evils were addressed, not obviously for once and for all, But instead of having religious wars, we will have freedom of religion. We won't have things like the Dobbs decision, where people like Alioto will speak contemptuously of people who have a different worldview about when it becomes morally mandatory to protect uh, uh, the life that begins with a single cell and that doesn't exist outside the womb for months. He's got a view. You don't find it in the Bible, but God said it as far as he's concerned. This is the brokenness, the nightmare, the path of the nightmare. And if you look at what Trump says he's going to do, create a system of law enforcement that he can use as a weapon against his enemies, even more than he already did the first term. That's trampling on what's in, that's recapitulating what the Bill of Rights is pointing toward in the history of unfree societies. And to get rid of a civil service that takes an oath to defend and protect the Constitution every time anybody becomes an officer of the United States, instead to people who have basically implicitly taken an oath to defend a man who's attacking the Constitution. So here we are. The escape from freedom problem can be addressed in the election of 2024. It is an opportunity for the voices of American democracy to talk to the American people about the sacred things that are at stake. Not in a way which is inappropriate in a free society, but in a way that is appropriate because it can speak in a universal language of justice, truth, human rights, human thriving. A universal language which nonetheless can provide some of that need for a sense of meaning and purpose. The job for the forces of democracy in this coming election will be to kindle in as many Americans as possible a fire in which they see voting for Joe Biden and against Donald Trump is work in the service of the sacred. Because it is. We truly are fortunate people. But maintaining a free society means understanding that part of what a free society needs to do is to get people's hearts aflame with uh, with the meaningfulness, the truth, and the sacredness that are at the core of the idea of a free society in which people can thrive and be themselves and exist in a world of goodwill among people who are different. There is something to sell to the American people that Donald Trump is a threat to, and the force behind him is a threat to, and that Joe Biden represents the path to saving from destruction. I wish that Joe Biden were the kind of communicator who could light the fire in the hearts of the American people. I'm a sucker for great oratory. One of the most thrilling years of my adolescence was a speech in 1964 or 60 at the Democratic Convention when Adlai Stevenson was put into nomination by the Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy. I had never been so excited by anything but a Michigan State football game before. And as I grew older and I heard the speeches that Winston Churchill gave to his people when they were facing fascism, not in an election, but in a potential invasion, I thrilled to that too. I mean, the kind of voice that some leaders have can awaken a passion of a moral and spiritual kind that it's wonderful when somebody is doing it in behalf of goodness. And likewise, my favorite president is FDR. I mean, I never heard Lincoln speak, obviously, but FDR had that capacity too, and though fault can be found with him here and there, he was an extraordinarily great stroke of luck for the United States to have become president to deal with two of our four greatest national crises, the Depression and then World War II. He was great at both of them. And he could inspire people with a sense of sacred purpose. I think that Joe Biden's been doing a fabulous job in a great many ways. I'm very impressed. He was much more capable than I thought he was. But he does not have that oratorical gift. He obviously succeeded to some extent in the 2022 election in kindling some fire in the electorate about saving American democracy against the dark fascistic MAGA forces. But we need more voices than Biden's. He's got his great abilities, and he's got his limitations. And lighting fire in the hearts of people is not one of his fortes. I think about Jamie Raskin. He combines being a constitutional scholar with a deep and clear knowledge of the whole terrain that's at stake in this battle, with a kind of moral passion. I don't know if he would say it's a spiritual passion, but a moral passion that conveys the meaning of what Trump and what this phony impeachment committee guy does, Comer. He's able to speak about what's at stake that shows the darkness. And I think he can also light a fire that brings the light, that shows why it's important that we remain a free society, and why we should bring a moral and spiritual passion to the ballot box to say we are going to vote for Joe Biden because of all that he represents that's sacred, that this country has been about, that our children and our grandchildren should continue to enjoy, and not the darkness that Trump represents. That's what I think has to be the heart of the coming campaign. There's a lot of other components in it, but light the fire in as many hearts as possible. The cult is probably out of reach, but I think that it's fairly clear that there is some tinder there to be lit by the forces of the good. In 60% of the American people, and maybe even a bit more. But that's the job. Show what's at stake in a way that means that our collective messaging is not just a sterile place where things that are bought and sold and politics of self-interest are there. We have a mission, and we are called upon to fulfill that mission. We don't have to say that there's a single God said it behind it, but we can see it just built into the structure of the world. That free societies are societies where human beings have been able to thrive like never before in the history of civilization. This is the step forward for humankind. The will of the people will control power, and power will not tyrannize and oppress and exploit and deceive the people. It's worth fighting for. The fire must be kindled. Thank you. Bye-bye.